Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club, where we are reading the book entitled Jackson, A Modern-Day Resurrection by Larren Cole. This is the true story of a 2-year-old boy, Jackson, who drowned in a pond on his family's property and had been dead for almost 30 minutes when he was pulled from the pond by his father Larren, the author of the book. What follows is Jackson's miraculous resurrection and restoration to perfect health after his father screamed at God to do something, and he did. The book also addresses the often asked question, what happens when we die? Providing both Jackson's answer and the comforting biblical commentary on the state of the dead. Death of young children by drowning is unfortunately a very common occurrence, and after Jackson's story was made public, Larren had the opportunity to provide counsel and Christian advice to many parents who had suffered such a loss. Permission to read this book has been granted by the author, and it is published by his family ministry, Desire Media. In our last reading, we covered chapters 3 and 4, which recounted the riveting drama of Larren seeing Jackson's lifeless body floating face down in the middle of the pond. His desperate but totally exhausting efforts to retrieve the body and drag him to shore. There was no doubt that Jackson was dead. His body was cold and pasty white, and Larren was beside himself with anguish. In his agony and grief, he screamed at God to do something, and then he noticed a tiny bubble at Jackson's nose. He administered CPR, and after 3 attempts, Jackson began to inhale. Praise God, who hears and answers prayers. But now, Jackson's body went into convulsions, and he moaned a terrible moaning, which got progressively worse. Taking him in his arms, Larren raced back to the house and called 911. Realizing the severity of the situation, the 911 operator instructed them to drive as fast as they safely could to meet the ambulance which was on its way. Once this happened, the emergency personnel took over. When they arrived at the hospital, Jackson was rushed into emergency with a team of doctors, nurses, and other professionals. Larren was by his son's side. The convulsions and moaning continued without abating, and Larren knelt and prayed, asking God, this time more calmly and with more confidence, that God had already performed a miracle to save his son's life and would restore him to good health. The fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Once off his knees, he went over to Jackson and, bending over him, asked if he was cold. To the surprise and joy of everyone in the room, the convulsions and moaning stopped, and in a clear voice, Jackson answered, yes. The room erupted into shouts of joy and relief. Jackson was back. The doctors tested all his senses, which worked just fine. He was able to eat. They could find no neurological damage either. Larren tested his memory by asking him to sing a song they had taught him, which he did. Then he sang another song, which they had never taught him, called He's Able, telling the story of how able our God is to save to the uttermost. When Larren asked him where he learned that song, His answer was, "I don't know." But it was obvious that he was clearly saying who had indeed saved him out of the mouths of babes. Jackson was dismissed from the hospital the next day since there was no further reason to hold him. Dear listeners, please don't forget, you can purchase this book online, both from desiremedia.org and amazon.com, and read along with us as we pick up the story today in chapter 5, entitled Return to the Pond. When we got home from the hospital that day, I felt like I was starting family life all over again. You might say I had a new lease on life. Never had my family seemed so precious to me. Mickey was given a 6-week leave of absence from her work, mandated by her doctor to recover emotionally from the entire recent trauma. I was given the rest of the current week off from work to do the same. This week turned out to be a very special week for me, in which I learned some valuable lessons. Please understand that I love each of my children equally, but this week I spent an unusually large portion of my time with Jackson. I took Jackson with me everywhere I went, as if we were glued together. I held him almost constantly. I slept with him, bathed with him, napped with him, ate with him, never leaving that precious soul alone, not even for a moment. I now esteemed his life with immeasurable value at a level higher than I ever did before. I remember the first time Jackson got back into the water. It was the very next Friday, our usual day to soak in the big jacuzzi tub as we take our baths in preparation for the Sabbath. I thought surely he would be a bit apprehensive about getting into water, but he wasn't at all. As we stepped down into the big jacuzzi tub for the first time since his drowning, I experienced some hesitation, but instead he held my hand tightly, looked with trusting eyes into my face, and followed me closely down into the water. I had to stop and say a little thank you prayer for this. Not only was I thankful that he didn't have a special phobia for water, but I was especially thankful that his trust in me was still strong. One of the things I often found myself doing during this week was simply watching Jackson sleep. I would often lay awake while Jackson slept by my side and hold my ear close to his mouth and listen. Listen. Just listen to him breathe. In and out, like music to my soul. I could listen for hours to the sound of his healthy 2-year-old lungs drawing in air and then effortlessly exhaling again. It grieves me even now to imagine these precious lungs filled with that slimy green pond water that crushed out his life only a short time ago. After about a week of this quality restoration time, the Lord stopped and spoke to me as plainly as if audible. He said, "Larry, look at the way you love this little boy. Look at how you're treating him with such interest and loving care. It's a natural thing for a parent to love his child. Through procreation, you as a parent feel a strong bond of love for your son. But now that you have played a part in his redemption, in rescuing him from death, your love for him has intensified many times over. Your love for him as his Redeemer has increased to a much higher dimension. Larry, that's how I love you. You were once dead in your sins, but I made you alive again. Ephesians 2 and verse 1. I have reached down into the dark, slimy pond of sin and rescued you. My love for you is not just a parent's love, but a Redeemer's love. Oh, how I love you. If you're anything like me, you might think that God's love reaches its limit when it compares to the love a parent has for its child. But read what God said about how his love compares to that of a mother's love. Can a woman forget her second child, that she should not have compassion on the son of her womb? Yea, they may forget, yet will I not forget thee. Isaiah 49, verse 15. God is saying that his love for us surpasses even the love of a mother or father. His love reaches the ultimate height when, as a creator or parent, he lays down his life for his children. Then, as Redeemer of his children, he tenderly seeks to lead us through life's journey. If this is true, I thought, then God has certainly gone to great lengths to share this insight with me. God must really want me to understand the depth of the love he has for me. And he picked a perfect method by which to instill this philosophy within my heart. Until now, I wasn't aware that such deep love existed, or at least I didn't really understand its magnitude. While contemplating this new idea, I opened my Bible and found the place that says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." John 15, verse 13. Jesus said that in trying to explain to his followers just how far the greatest kind of love would go. Not only did he say it, but also he did it. Giving his life demonstrated how he loves us with a greater love, a Redeemer's love. This caused my mind to go back a few years to a story that made the headlines for months. It was the story of baby Jessica, who fell down a well shaft and was stuck deep down in the earth for a few days. Jessica's story had an incredible ending. The rescuers, headed by one particular fireman, went to great lengths to rescue baby Jessica, even taking some risks along the way. The story didn't end with the successful rescuing of this poor little soul. The fireman in charge who was so intent on saving this little girl, developed a special relationship with baby Jessica after her rescue. A pure and powerful bond of love had developed within the fireman's heart for baby Jessica that only a redeemer could feel for the one he has redeemed. It was an emotional ending to a story that now made more sense to me. With the end of this amazing week came the Sabbath. Pastor Del Gribel, the pastor of my church, heard about all that happened last Monday and wanted the theme of his sermon that Sabbath to be on what happened to Jackson and how God, in his infinite mercy, still does miracles. Pastor Dell stood up in front of the church and held up a little red shirt that the EMTs had cut off Jackson during his ambulance ride. He then announced to the congregation what happened that last Monday. I want to bring up Dad now and let him tell us in his own words just what happened, he said, as he invited me to the church platform. Pastor Dell apparently had a little experience in investigative reporting. He was able to skillfully help me put the events of last Monday into perspective. At the end of my talk, he called up Jackson, who was the picture of health and energy, demonstrating how thorough his miracle really was. When he heard about the song that Jackson sang while in the hospital, Pastor Dell invited the entire church to sing He's Able. The service concluded with a baptism, which was fitting. The symbol of being born again certainly reflected all that took place. My 2-year-old son was to me as if he had been born all over again, with a new outlook on life and a new perspective on the love a Redeemer has for his children. I was given new life also. Never again would I view the love of God with shallowness, for he had revealed in a meaningful way the depth of his love. Pastor Dell wanted to spend some more time with me in prayer and reflection upon all that had happened. Together, he and I returned to the scene of the drowning down at the pond on Short Walk Ranch. He had some questions he wanted to ask and wanted to find out more about how everything really happened so he could put the details into perspective. Not only was Dell a pastor, but he also was an army chaplain and seemed to have a little experience with investigating details and then reporting them. As we walked down the hill along the creek and over to the pond, the first thing that caught Pastor Dell's attention was a little toy riding tractor that Jackson had been playing with. It was parked right next to the shore of the pond. On the seat of the tractor was a water bottle with a pop-top lid. The lid to the bottle had been dismantled with the end part taken off and put inside the bottle, and the screw on the lid part was screwed back on top of the bottle where it belonged. Pastor Dell picked up the bottle and asked, "What's this all about?" At the time of the rescue, I didn't notice the bottle. "Oh, wow," I answered. "That's what Jackson always does to these bottles. He screws the lid off and somehow manages to get the nozzle off, and then he puts the nozzle inside of the bottle and screws the lid back on again." Examining the bottle, Pastor Dell marveled at this. Jackson's very mechanical, I continued. I can't even get off the piece off the lid. Larry, show me where you first saw Jackson, Dell said to me as he surveyed the pond. I pointed out to the middle of the pond and said, it was out there, about 25 to 30 feet offshore. How did you see him? He asked. Well, he was floating face down, right on top of the surface, and he was wearing a bright red sweatshirt, which made him very obvious. His arms were both spread out and bent at the elbows. His elbows were held up at the surface of the water, I answered, as the vivid image painfully flashed into my mind. How deep is this pond? He asked. About 12 feet, I said. But at this time of the year, it's overflowing with all the spring runoff, so it's more like 13 feet now. Dell seemed to wonder at this. Normally, in a situation like this, he said, a child who drowns sinks to the bottom. This is very unusual, that he should be floating on top. Well, I answered, if he had sunk to the bottom, it would have taken me hours to find him, because this pond is so muddy that you can't see more than 12 inches into it. After a thoughtful moment, Dell said to me, Larry, the way you described how Jackson was floating with his elbows outstretched leads me to believe that an unseen hand was holding him up so you could see him. Tell me something else, Dell said to me. Were his bowels released? Well, yes, I answered. When I took his pants off in the living room, I also took off his diaper, which was loaded. Why do you ask that? He said to me, when a person dies, one thing that happens is that his bowels fully release because of the lack of muscle tone in a dead body. Larry, your son was truly dead. This was the work of a miracle. How long do you suppose he was in there? We continued to discuss all the details of this near tragedy. Well, Madison was wet also, which means that she was in the water with Jackson. She said he went in first and disappeared into the water. She must have gotten in after Jackson, then struggled to get out. After getting out, I don't think she came straight home. Madison is easily distracted, and since she didn't seem to be worried when she told me that Jackson drowned, I'm assuming that she took her own sweet time coming back to the house. She did tell me that she came back home through the gravity cavity, which is a road all the way to the east end of the property, well past the direct route to the house, and definitely the long way home. When she did finally reach home, she approached me slowly as I administered first aid to Alex's head wound. I remember her coming up to us, not at all in a hurry, but casually. She waited patiently for some time to interrupt what I was doing. When she did finally tell me Jackson drowned, it took some time for me to find him, because she clammed up after I became frantic and wouldn't tell me where he drowned. I first went down to Gravity Cavity, hoping she meant that he was in the creek at the bottom of the hill. By the time I reached the pond, Jackson's body had already managed to drift out to the middle of the pond. It was a still day, with no wind to blow his body out to the middle. Based on this evidence, I would guess that Jackson was dead in the pond at least 20 to 30 minutes. It could very well have been longer. Many people have asked me, was the water cold? Most of the people who ask this are people with a medical background, such as doctors and nurses. The reason they ask this is because if a child drowns in freezing cold water, it has a better chance of being revived. The child's body can go into shock from the instant cold and prevent the child from taking too much water into the lungs. But the truth is, the water was not cold. It was springtime in late April, and most of the water comes from underground. If the pond wasn't so muddy, it might make a decent swimming hole because it definitely was not too cold. Pastor Dell and I talked a little while longer at the edge of the pond. Before we left, he wanted us to spend a moment in prayer, thanking God for the wonderful deliverance he gave to Jackson. When we finished thanking God, we picked up the tractor and the bottle and walked back up to the house. "Do you mind if I borrow the water bottle?" he asked me. "My wife will be giving a talk at one of the churches, and I think she will want to tell this story." A little memento, such as this bottle, will help make the story more personal. "Sure," I said, handing the bottle to him. He later returned the bottle, and I still have that bottle to this day. I also saved a few other mementos of that day, such as the little red sweatshirt he wore, and of course, the tractor. The end of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. What happened when you were dead? 1 week later, I had to return to work at the hospital in Alturas. The most difficult thing about doing this was having to leave Jackson. Not once had I left him during this week. I had been with him constantly since pulling him out of the pond. But now it was time for me to go back to work and get on with life, which of course required leaving Jackson for the day. Even though he was safe at home with Mom, I have to admit, this caused no small amount of separation anxiety, which proved to be somewhat distracting while I was at work. Another source of distraction while at work that day was the fact that I was bombarded by people coming up to me who wanted to congratulate me on the happy outcome to my son's drowning. In fact, this continued to happen the whole week. Unfortunately, I wasn't quite as proficient at my work as I probably should have been with all the distractions. To top it off, the local newspaper caught wind of the story and wanted to do a long interview so they could publish it for their next issue. A person from the Modoc County Record came out during my lunch period and did a lengthy interview and took some pictures for the article. In a small town like Alturas, everybody reads the local newspaper. A new issue comes out once every week, and the day a new issue is released is sort of a weekly highlight for Modoc County residents. Since the release of the article, I was contacted by a variety of different folks concerning the story. Some just wanted to say how happy they were for how well Jackson turned out. Still many others contacted me to tell me about how they had gone through a similar situation that didn't turn out so well. I discovered that this kind of tragedy is all too familiar to so many people. One such person was a nurse named Laura who lost her 2-year-old boy to a drowning. As I talked with Laura about her tragedy, my heart was crushed because I know the feeling of utter despair that a parent feels at the loss of a child. The pain and anguish I felt that day when I first pulled Jackson out of the pond came flooding back into my mind all over again as Laura told me her horrible story. The death of any loved one is so hard to take, but nothing can compare to the pain Laura must feel. I've lost my share of loved ones during my lifetime. I even lost my mother just a few years ago, which was very painful. But when I thought I'd lost my son, the sorrow was excruciating beyond measure. My prayers and sympathy go out to every parent who has suffered through the loss of a child. I guess that includes God now, doesn't it? Voluntarily, God went through this loss when he gave his son to die. How painful was it to him when his son, who was dying on the cross, cried out, "Why have you forsaken me?" How did God suffer through that kind of pain? There is an old song that says, "I don't know why he loved me, but I'm glad, oh so glad, that he did." Death makes me sick. Death is the ultimate enemy to all humanity. So much of this sinful world revolves around death. From cemeteries, to junkyards, to repair shops, to jails, and on, death is ultimately the culprit to all the world's problems. Satan is responsible for this hideous, appalling invention. Not only is he responsible for coming up with the idea, he also is responsible for covering up the true and dreadful nature of this beast called death. He has tricked most of the world into believing that death is not death. His lie is, you don't really die when you die. And it seems like most of the world has fallen for this line. A short while after being back at work, I received a phone call from a nurse who knew all about Jackson's story. Her name was Kathy, and she called to ask me a very serious question. She said to me, "Larry, can you do me a favor?" "What is it, Kathy?" I replied. "Could you ask Jackson," she continued, "what did he see? What did he feel? And what did he go through when he was actually dead in the pond?" Wanting to be perfectly objective about this, and with all due respect to Kathy, I said to her, "Sure, let me ask him." So I asked him. Very candidly, and without any persuasion one way or the other, I said to Jackson, "Jackson, tell Daddy what happened to you when you were dead in the pond after you drowned. Did you see anything? Did you go anywhere? Did you hear or feel anything?" Did you or your body do anything? I felt kind of silly asking this, but I knew that Kathy was serious about wanting to know. So I tried to ask Jackson the question just the way Kathy wanted it asked. Jackson didn't look at me funny or anything when he answered. Without hesitation, he answered, I didn't do anything. I didn't see anything. Then I asked him a follow-up question. Jackson, what is the last thing you remember before you drowned? Jackson's response was, I was playing by the pond, and then I fell in the water, and then nothing. Wanting to make sure we both could understand, I asked again, Jackson, what was the last thing you remember after you fell into the water? He replied, I went under the water, and then nothing. Returning to Kathy on the phone, I said, Kathy, did you hear that? I think she must have heard at least part of his response, because she was silent for a few moments, as if contemplating what she had heard. Jackson said he went in the water, went under, and then has no recollection of anything after that. He remembers nothing happening to him while he was dead. I continued in summarizing Jackson's answer. With a very somber voice, Kathy said, thank you, and hung up the phone. The way she answered led me to believe that she was wondering about death and rethinking the things she had been taught regarding what happens to a person when they die. I got a chance to talk further with Kathy about the topic of death. Feeling the prompting of the Holy Spirit, and with Bible in hand, I sat down with Kathy in her office one day, and we had ourselves a real Bible study. Most of the Christian world thinks that when you die, you go immediately to heaven or hell or someplace in between, but you don't really die. They actually think the Bible teaches this, and they take this for granted as a fact without really checking the Bible to see the truth. Kathy listened to these remarks with an inquisitive yet somewhat skeptical ear as I continued. Actually, this is the first lie that was ever told. When Satan confronted Eve by the forbidden tree in the Garden of Eden, he said to her, has God said, you will surely die if you eat this fruit? You will not surely die. Genesis 3, verses 1 through 4. This was a blatant lie. It was Satan's controversial response to a clear statement of God. God said, you will die. And Satan said, you will not die. It seems he's still repeating this same lie, and most of the world accepts it. Well, what does the Bible teach about death? Kathy hesitatingly asked, not quite sure what kind of fanatic she might be talking to. Well, I said, the Bible is full of texts that plainly tell us what death is like. And there is also examples in the Bible of dead people who were resurrected. Let's start with an example, which gives us real-life answers we can understand. Let's go to probably the most famous miracle that Jesus ever did. That is the miracle of when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. I took a survey one time at my church on what people considered to be Jesus' greatest miracle, and Lazarus got the most votes. In fact, this miracle got twice as many votes as even the second place answer. It all started with Jesus' friend Lazarus getting sick. His sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, "Lord, he whom thou lovest is sick." John 11 and verse 3. Rather than return with the messenger and heal Lazarus, Jesus answered the messenger by saying, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God." Verse 4. Jesus stayed where he was for a few more days, during which time Lazarus did actually die. Then Jesus told his disciples they were going to Judea, where Lazarus was. When they asked him why, he answered, "Our friend Lazarus is asleep, but I'm going to wake him out of sleep." Verse 11. Not understanding Jesus, the disciples said to him, "Lord, if he sleeps, he does well." They thought he meant Lazarus was napping. So Jesus had to plainly say to them, "Lazarus is dead." As we read through this story, I said to Kathy, Jesus compared death to sleeping. I believe, like Jesus taught, that death is like a sleep. In sleep, you know nothing. You're unaware of your surroundings, and you're oblivious to time. You stay in your bed, and you don't go anywhere. I then shared with her a story that happened to me that I thought would illustrate the state of being dead. The story was in a medical setting, which of course was easy for a nurse to understand. It was a story of the time I had surgery. The operating team hovered over me in the bright OR room, and one of them held a great big mask in his hand. It was the anesthesiologist, and his job was to put me to sleep. As I lay on the operating table, with all those faces looking at me, the guy with the mask said to me, "I want you to slowly count backwards from 10 to 0. And then he put the mask over my nose and mouth. I stared into about a dozen faces above me as I began to count. They were all smiling at me and jokingly saying, "Good night, have a nice nap, see you in the morning." The next thing I remembered doing was just blinking my eyes. While staring into the faces of all those silly folks on the operating team, I blinked my eyes. Just a little blink. But when I opened my eyes, from that little blink, they were all gone. Where did they all go? I asked as I sat up and looked around. That's when I noticed I was in a completely different room now than before my blink. Furthermore, it was several hours later than before my blink. Then I realized I had been asleep. The surgery was over, and I was in the recovery room. I said to Kathy, for a Christian, death is like being in a deep, deep sleep. Years and years may go by. You will be completely unaware of time or anything else that goes on until Jesus calls you out of your sleep. It will be just like that blink I experienced on the operating table. Continuing on with the story of Lazarus, we read that by the time Jesus got to where Lazarus was, he found that he had been dead 4 days already. At the funeral site, Lazarus' sister met Jesus with these words, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Verse 21. Jesus answered by telling her that her brother would rise again. I then wanted Kathy to pay special attention to Martha's response to Jesus. Martha, who was a special friend to Jesus, who had followed him closely, who had been taught by him, who had received spiritual understanding at the feet of Jesus, answered him by saying, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Verse 24. I asked Kathy if she noticed what Martha said. Did she say, I know my brother is in heaven now, singing with the angels? Or did she say, my brother is roasting in hellfire? What was Martha's theology on what it's like to be dead? Kathy acknowledged the obvious, that Martha, a student of the great teacher, knew just what Jesus taught, that a dead friend of Jesus sleeps in a grave until the last day when there will be a resurrection. Finishing the story about Lazarus, we read about the great moment when Jesus cried out to Lazarus, Lazarus, come forth. I made special notice to the fact that Jesus didn't say, come down from heaven or come up from hell. He called to the dead guy in the tomb, who actually responded by coming back to life and out of the tomb. This is sort of a miniature picture of what will take place on the great resurrection day. Those friends of Jesus will hear his voice and be raised. Kathy, I said, that's the good news about death. It's not this weird disembodiment from your body where your soul leaves your body at death and heads on to its reward immediately upon death. There is one last thing to notice about Lazarus. Never does he say anything about what it's like to be dead. If he had left his body and went somewhere, don't you think he would have said something about it? That news would have made every headline story in the newspapers of the day. There were a lot of people who, just like our day, want to know what really happens to a dead person. I'm sure many people asked Lazarus what it was like to be dead. And like Jackson, who said, I felt nothing, saw nothing, did nothing. The Bible also says nothing about Lazarus transitioning to another state of life. The end of chapter 6 of Jackson, A Modern Day Resurrection by Larren Cole.